She was a girl with a divided heart, like the light and the dark, a divided heart, between two continents and somewhere far home, but where it really lay was deep within her soul. But where it really lay was deep within her soul.
Hello, and welcome to the third episode of Nikki Pistorius Profiler on Record. And by now, you've watched the third episode of Catch Me a Killer, the television series that is based on my book, Catch Me a Killer. So in this episode, we meet General Brits, which was my commander. A little bit of history of Brits. He was initially the commander of the Pretoria Murder and Robbery Unit. Then he was promoted and he became the national commander of all the murder and robbery units. And after that, he was promoted, and that's when he became a general, and that was the serious and violent crimes component. So under him would fall all the murder and robbery units nationwide, some COVID units, the taxi violence units, the special investigation team that was headed by Brigadier Engelbrecht, who later became a general as well, and then my little unit. So the thing about General Brits is he was quite legendary, and people said if he donned the lion skin like Hercules of old, then everybody was very, very scared of him, as they shouldn't be. But he also had another side to him, and in the series he's called Petersburg, and he's played by the actor Albert Moritz, which was a very, very good match. Thank you, Albert. And what Albert brought out is General Saker also had another side to him. He could be quite a tease, and he could be quite playful. And he had these nicknames for many of us. And my nickname was Selepe, which referred to psychologists. So he called me Selepe. And he played it off. Now, when I met him in the halls of head office for the first time, he had heard about the success of the station stranger arrest. And he said that I should be working for him under his direct command because I was active. I was not in a supportive role as a psychologist, I was an active profiler. So he arranged that and got me in office close to him, so I was with him. And then we started talking and I told him about the course that I'd like to design for the detectives. I was busy with that, and that I would like the investigative psychology unit. So I got the investigative psychology unit. I was commander of that unit, which sounds very impressive, except that you were only one. It's just me. Okay. So that was the unit, and that's how it started. So General Saker was very tolerant of my, I would call it, I was a bit unorthodox in the police, because I came from an academic background and not a police background, etc. And he encouraged that. And I would also say sometimes he would actually encourage me to break the rules a little bit, much to the chagrin of the other generals. We used to like rules, etc. Standing orders, blah, blah, blah. So I know in the boardrooms with the other generals, he would often have my back, and he would encourage me to such an extent that the other generals at some stage would refer to me as General Saker's little porcelain doll. But anyway, I'm minded that as long as I could do what I wanted to do. And I did. And it was also General Saker that agreed that I could go to Dundee in Scotland to attend the ex-FBI profilers Robert Brits and Roy Hazelwood in their course on profiling. So that's how I met Robert Brits, the ex-FBI, which you will also meet in the series. So General Saker had the saying, he always said, as long as your scoreboard is rolling, he doesn't mind. And the scoreboard was rolling because of the cooperation between the detectives and myself. We had glitches, but it was good men and good women working together against injustice. So he had our back. And he was really very, very proud of us. And then also, sadly, in 2018, he passed away. So that was a great loss for us. He'd already retired, but it was a loss. But in that time, the investigative psychology unit doubled its manpower. And we were there too. And in the series, you'll meet Erica. And Erica is played by Donna Cormack-Thompson. And she's a fantastic actress. And I love the interaction and the caring and the dynamics between Erica and Mickey. That to me, I really like that. So at that stage, I was finishing the curriculum for this course in basic investigative psychology. And General Saker decided he liked it. And he said, okay, what we are going to do is we're going to go on a road trip all over the country and visit each one of the murder and robbery units that he was the commander of. And I can select 2 detectives from every unit for my course. Great, so that was all going to happen. So this is a little bit informative. I said I would be informative. So how does a serial killer investigation work? If there is a serial killer that is active in a certain region, then the detectives that were trained, they were mustered and taken out of their daily duties, and one of the trained detectives would then lead that investigation. If there are trained detectives, they would join in, or some of the others were not trained, still they would join in. That would be our detective team, which ranged from 5 to 10 to 20. How the case was. Then he had auxiliary services, which would be your profiler, could be me or could be Erica. And then he had the crime analysts, and there was entomologists, etc., and there was the pathologists and crime photographers. So he had a whole team. And that's how it worked once there was one active in the region. So there was nobody under my command. The detectives were not in my unit under my command. Eric and I were on our own little thing. So we couldn't give orders to anybody. In any case, we were not detectives, we were psychologists. So what would happen is we would be deployed to that region, and we would live there for a while we were working on the investigation, and the murder and robbery unit that was targeted would set up an operational room for us, which was sometimes just an office, sometimes a caravan, sometimes a boardroom. And there we would put up the suspects and the maps and the victims and etc. And that's our operational room that we worked from. In the beginning, I did experience some lack of tolerance, I would call it, from the commanders of those units. And they didn't like my presence always, the degree in a skirt, whatever. But we all worked for General Saker. I never worked for them. In it wasn't under their command, we were all under his command. And what he said, that was the rule. So I didn't have a choice, really. But later on, the commanders went to the general and they said they want a course for themselves because they actually want to be on par of what their detectives knows because they saw we were being successful. So I agreed. So we had the course for the commanders, which was quite successful. And after that, we were on much more friendly terms, catching serial killers. So in this episode 3 of Catch Me a Killer, we look at 2 killers. The first one in the series is called Warren Barnes. And that's sort of an amalgamation of characteristics of serial killers, but it's basically on the Witbank serial killer. So this person was already arrested, but he entered an insanity plea. So as a psychologist, they wanted me to interview him and to see if he's malingering, which means if he's lying, if he's pretending. So the second brigade of escaping criminal liability is a common motivation for malingering when people pretend to be mentally ill. However, the criminals often do not comprehend that even if they are found incompetent to stand trial, the charges will not be dropped. They will be kept in psychiatric custody until they are found fit to stand trial. So there are 2 time periods of importance here. The first thing is, were they that mentally ill when they committed the crime that they didn't know what they were doing, or that they couldn't control what they were doing, or they didn't know right from wrong? Because sometimes, although people may be suffering from a mental illness, they still have periods of rationality. Or it's not that the mental illness had any effect upon the crime. So that's the first that they look at. The second one is, at the time of the trial, are they now mentally fit to stand trial, and can they comprehend the process of the trial? So there are two periods. Until they are found fit to stand trial, they are not free to go. They will be kept in a psychiatric facility as the custody of the state. So it's not as if they're walking free. And there, they will be subjected to forensic evaluations. Now, a forensic psychologist can use psychometric tests. They can use hypnosis. In cases where I did need hypnosis, I would contact somebody from an independent psychologist from university, that was qualified to do that if I had to. And then they also have discussions with family members, with ward nurses, etc. It is impossible for anybody to pretend to be mentally ill if they're not 24 hours a day. It cannot be done. There are too many ways that they can be caught out. So you're not going to get away from the crime by trying to enter an insanity plea. Now, I remember in 1966, when I was a little girl, so you can date me if you like. In any case, there was a person called Stephenus, and Stephenus assassinated the Prime Minister John F. Verwoerd. So he entered an insanity plea. He was 44 years old when he shot Verwoerd. At the age of 81, he died of pneumonia in the psychiatric ward, which means he was there for about 33 years. If he had not entered an insanity plea, he might have been out after 25 years. So people make the mistake of thinking they will escape punishment. They will not. They will still be incarcerated. And if you are in a psychiatric ward, in the criminal psychiatric ward, it's not much different than being in prison. You are isolated. So in the long run, it's really not to the benefit of the person to try and pretend that they are mentally ill. It's not a good idea. Okay. So a mental illness and amnesia cannot be conjured up just to suit you whenever it does. In this case, in the series, Catch Me Killer, you will see this person is pretending to suffer from what people generally call multiple personality disorder, which is not schizophrenia. That's something completely different. People often confuse the two, but they're not. So we call it dissociative identity disorder. That is the correct psychological term. It's a bit of educational value for it. So dissociative identity disorder, if you should read the book Sybil, you will get a very good idea of the intense torture and hurt that a person is put through. And then that is what I testified in the trial, in the series. The person would internalize that pain and abuse and torture to such an extent that different personalities split. The ego splits into different personalities. That's the only way that the ego can deal with it as a child. Those personalities are unaware of each other, and you cannot just call them up when it suits you. So it's an internalization. Whilst with a serial killer will externalize the offences that he feels or she feels has been committed against them by killing other people in retribution. So the origins of the splitting and the origins of the serial killer is completely different. Serial killers cannot pretend to have dissociative personality disorder. And dissociative personality disorder is so scarce that in my career of 30 years or longer of being a psychologist, I encountered it once. And it was in a clinical setting, not in a forensic setting. The same as amnesia. It is very difficult to maintain a pretense that you cannot remember. And I think in America, one of the hillside stranglers, Kenneth Biaki, he tried to enter an insanity plea and he failed. So your chances of really succeeding with an insanity plea, if you're not really mentally ill, it's just about zero. So I wouldn't recommend them to do that. So in this case, this specific killer was eventually found guilty of 1 rape and 2 murders, and he was sentenced to 99 years in prison. He got out after 5. Okay, let's see what happens. So, yes. So the next serial killer that we encounter in this episode is the Cleveland serial killer. Now the Cleveland serial killer was, that investigation was run by Brixton Murder and Robbery. Famous, infamous Brixton Murder and Robbery in Johannesburg. Now the actor that plays the detective in this case is called Selepe Tsubani. And I must compliment Selepe for the way in which he portrays how I was treated by Brixton, which was not very pleasant. To say the least, they were not very much impressed with my existence. Was it not for General Brits? But in any case, I didn't mind if they ran the investigation because I was busy teaching my detectives as well in the very first course. And Brixton Murder and Robbery was also the home of the legendary Captain Piet Bielefeld. And Piet was later promoted to superintendent. Now, Piet Bielefeld, through his career, investigated many serial killers, and I could learn from him. So it wasn't necessary for me in any case to attend my course, just to put that on the record. So what is very historically accurate in this series is that David Selepe, the Cleveland serial killer, was killed, when he pointed out the crime scene and he attacked one of the detectives, and they shot him. That's historically correct. Charlotte, the wonderful Charlotte Hope, the actress, also shows my frustration that he was shot because I lost an opportunity of speaking to him and doing research and getting to know them better. So that really got to me. What is not completely historically accurate in the series is where Charlotte or Mickey visits the body of David Selepe in the morgue. Quite frankly, why would I go and visit his body? It's not as if he could tell me something, isn't it? Anyway, it's creative licensing for you, but okay, let's carry on. So, since I cannot tell you much more about David Selepe because he's dead, I'd like to be informative, and I'd like to talk to you, as I promised, about the definitions of serial killers, because people often confuse a serial killer with a spree killer or a mass murderer. So let us be guided by Robert Resler and the FBI and what are their definitions of this. The FBI defined mass murderers as a person who kills several victims during one event and one location. So there's no cooling off period in between, and family members may be the victims as well. In South Africa, we did have the incident of Baron Straden, who called himself the White Wolf. The Columbine school shootings in America would be an example of mass murder. I was there at that time. So these killers are usually motivated by hate, and it could include racial hate. The spree killer is defined as one or more persons who kill 2 or more victims during one event, and they have a long or short duration, and it's at 2 or more locations with no cooling off period. So historically, Bonnie and Clyde would be good examples of the spree killers. In South Africa, we had Charmaine Phillips and Peter Grimling, who killed several people in 1983. So their motivation is usually thrill. And the murders will end in either suicide or the police shoots them. The actor, Sean Cameron Michael, plays Robert Resler in the TV series, and he coined the term serial killer. He explained the term by using the example of a television series. As an episode ends on a cliffhanger, the viewers are kept in anticipation and suspense of the series until the next episode. Very much like the serial killer anticipates the next murder after killing the previous victim. So Resler defined a serial killer as a person or persons who kill more than 3 victims during more than 3 events at 3 or more locations with a cooling off period in between, and there is also premeditated planning and fantasy present. I propose the following definition of a serial killer. A serial killer is a person who murders several victims, usually strangers, at different times and not necessarily at the same location, with a cooling off period in between. The motive is intrinsic. It's an irresistible compulsion fueled by fantasy, which may lead to torture or sexual abuse, mutilation, and necrophilia. I added the second victim because I don't think we need to wait for a third victim to be killed before we can define this as a serial killer and get our investigation up and running. I also added the motives of an intrinsic motive and torture and necrophilia and the irresistible compulsion. Now, what would be the difference between a serial killer and a robber? Let's say we have a robber that penetrates a house and he kills the occupants of the house at a certain location at a certain time. 2 weeks later, it's another house, another time, and he also kills the people and so forth. So he's a person that is killing different people at different locations over different times with cooling off period. What makes him not a serial killer? The motive, the intrinsic motive. Because the robber's motive is greed, it's money, it's financial. The serial killer's motive is intrinsic. Some of them don't even understand themselves why they kill. And as I've explained before, it originates with a fixation in one of Freud's psychosexual developmental phases, which then grows into a fantasy, and then he rehearses the fantasy and he starts acting out this fantasy. But reality is never as perfect as fantasy. We're all heroes in our fantasies, aren't we? Nobody's ever going to fantasize about themselves being a loser. So he keeps on acting out the fantasy, trying to get it right. And there's a cooling off period, and that then is your intrinsic motive of the serial killer. And it's very unique, that fantasy, to every serial killer. And that's why, some people are copycat killers. They try and copycat that particular serial killer. Or you might have a person that killed his wife and he dropped the body hoping for us to include that into our series. If you can find the fantasy on the crime scene, and this is what I taught the detectives and they learned fast, you would recognize the fantasy as you would look at a painting and the painting tells you something specifically about the artist. It's the same way as you look at the crime scene, it's going to tell you about that specific person. So that's the big difference between serial killers and robbers. Good. So Resler also taught us about the 4 phases of crime. So in your pre-crime phase, just a short summary, this is educational, that would be when the serial killer fantasizes, thinking about, he's going to commit the murder, he might get a weapon, etc. Then there is the murder itself, that would be selection of the victim, the actual murder, the murder weapon, and then there would be the disposal of the body. It's not that easy to get rid of a body. Some people would just leave them right there where they are. Some people would pose them, and we would see later on some people would transport them, some people would burn them. So that's that phase. And then the last phase is the post-crime phase. We've seen serial killers. They can either they can attend funerals of the victims. They can call the press, as we'll see in one of the next cases. They visit the victims' families if they can. They try and insert themselves in the investigations. There's several things that they would do, and most of them just carry on afterwards with their normal life, like ordinary people. So many people are under the impression that are serial killers mad, or they are mad, or they're crazy, and they're not. So I'd like to take the example of Jack the Ripper, who in the 1900s, as we all know, was creating havoc in Whitechapel, in London, killing the prostitutes. So the last victim was called Mary Jane Kelly, and she was found in her little room that she rented, and she was completely eviscerated. And there was very bizarre scenes in that crime scene. It was a mess. So if we look at that in isolation, we would say this is the work of a madman. But if we look at the series in context, a few hours before, Jack had killed a prostitute with the name of Catherine Eddowes. He killed her in the street, but before he could act out his fancy of eviscerating her and cutting her up, he was disturbed. So he left her right there. Then he went on and then he met up with Mary Jane Kelly. And he took Mary Jane Kelly inside her room and locked the door, and that's where he cut her up and etc. Now the fact that he took her inside the room where he can act out his fantasy without being disturbed, that's premeditation. That is rational thought. So although Jack was losing his marbles a little bit, he was still rational enough to make that decision not to be caught. So if I had lived in that lifetime, I would have advised the detectives that this is not a madman that we're looking for. It would be a rational man that we are looking for. And people sometimes find it very hard to believe that ordinary people can commit murders like this, but they can. They definitely can. So serial killers are not raving lunatics. They don't foam at the mouth. They don't have stickers on their forehead saying, I'm a serial killer. They're not. They drive cars. They buy groceries. They go to church. They're normal people. David Selepe had a training institute. Norman Simons was a teacher. Moses Itorius, one of the others, would have a welfare organization. One of the serial killers that we meet later met his victims in church. Some of them are church ministers. They could be your neighbor, as we will also see in one of the upcoming episodes. So regarding this whole thing about irresistible compulsion, technically, because they have cooling off periods, it means there are sometimes years or weeks or months in their lives that they do not commit murders, which means they can control it. Or we take the rational man example. So if somebody is going to commit a murder or kill somebody and there's a policeman, then would they commit it? No, a rational man would not. There's a policeman. A mad person would. But if there's a policeman, no, they would not. So they can control that compulsion. Do they want to? No, because they enjoy the killing. As Mickey explains right in the beginning of the first episode, they feel unlimited, they feel godly. When you have somebody's life literally in your hands and you can strangle them, and they lose consciousness and you let go and they breathe again, you literally feel like God. And that's why they like killing, and it's not such an irresistible compulsion. So, if ever there should be, unfortunately, a serial killer operative in your neighborhood, then do not be on the lookout for a crazy mad person, because it's not. Be on the lookout for ordinary people. And your gut feeling will warn you about something, and then contact the police. We do not need riots. We do not need witch hunts, because that distracts the detectives from focusing on the killer. So tell the police when you have a gut feeling about an ordinary person in your neighborhood. It is the ordinary men and women that will make the difference in fighting injustice. In the Cleveland and the following Attridgeville investigations, although we published warnings about active serial killers in the press, the women still trusted the men who promised them jobs. They still got into taxis and they followed the men into remote areas. We pleaded with them to be alert and to alert their family members of their whereabouts, to give them details of job interviews, to report back to the family members when they arrived at destinations. In case we should later identify one of them as a victim, then we can ask the family and we can retrace her steps, and maybe that would give us a clue. Most of the women did not heed us, but thanks to those who did, it was possible to identify David Selepe as a suspect. In this episode, we see Nikki and Erica looking at the clothing of the victim, figuring out why a woman would wear stockings to go to work or to a job interview. All over the world, ordinary women get up in the morning, they dress, they go to work, they take public transport, they go about their daily tasks and their business. They drop their children at school, they buy vegetables, they buy fruit, they work in the markets, and they are joined by ordinary men, all out to earn an honest living. So none of them expect a predator to rob them of their living. They all expect to go home at the end of the day and spend time with their families until they don't. I'm not advocating that we should become paranoid, but a little vigilance and a little more observation and a lot more trusting our guts can go a long way in saving lives. So to get back to our series, Catch Me a Killer, at the end of this series, there is the ominous statement that another victim was found in the same vicinity that David Selepe had left his victims. David Selepe is dead. So in episode 4 of the series, we are going to meet one of the most prolific and sadistic serial killers in the history of South Africa. So I promised you I would be informative and educational, hopefully inspirational. I will give you, through my personal experience, an authentic account of what it was like working with the minds of the serial killers. I want to demystify them, and I do not want to sensationalize them. Thank you for watching, and if you like what we're doing, then vote with your thumbs up and share it and subscribe. And I will see you next week after you've watched the 4th episode of the TV series Catch Me a Killer, and I will meet you on Nikki Pistorius' Profiler on Record.
She was a girl with a divided heart, like the light and the dark, a divided heart, between two continents and somewhere far home, but where it really lay was deep within her soul. But where it really lay was deep within her soul.